So the other day I was kind of formulating a series of notes for a response in the realm of these discussions pertaining to the idea of Jesus and Christianity in relation to historical experiences in the Americas or the United States, and just the general stage of interpretation of Christianity in relation to these ideas of conversion and the interpreted message of Jesus and stuff like that. And the tendency to kind of look at native teachings as being absent from God and things like that. And it influences a certain type of framework that people interpret Christianity by, and then in turn the characteristics of God and what's going on there. So it's this really massive discussion, which I'll probably have to chisel away at in a lot of different ways, like I've been doing. But I formulated a few notes just to kind of talk about it. And so I just kind of wanted to go over those notes really quickly on some topics to consider. So first of all, in the realm of this topic, this discussion, I'm not anti to Christianity, but I have gone through a lot of different things in life experiences that that influenced the way I kind of went on a personal spiritual journey. It's a long story. I actually have 2 introductory preliminary recordings where I meant to go into these quick topics, but I got off on this whole long story. I think I just needed that for myself. From time to time, I'll rehash the series of things that my life had just involved, which kind of started my senior year in high school with little seeds kind of quickening, occurring within me, and then culminating through different seasons of my life up until now. I'm like in my mid-40s. And from time to time, because I feel like I still have to remind myself, like, is this really happening? Was this really happening? And so I think from time to time, every year or so, or a few times a year or so, I'll sit down and rehash these stories and tell them over and over as though I'm trying to convince myself. And then the next day, it's quite common. I'll wake up and think, I'll just delete that and just forget about it. Like, why did I talk about that again? I just kind of go back and forth with it. Generally, though, it's pretty consistent as I keep talking about it, and it is something I'm involved in. I think it would be interesting to maybe somehow or another connect with other people that have similar discussions and whatnot along these lines, and have it kind of be productive and shift the conversation a little bit. I do tend to think I have it in me to kind of shift the conversation a little bit, because I start to find in general, maybe not entirely, but in general, the Christian conversation keeps being defined in this similar framework. And I just feel it in me that it's the same type of confines and beliefs that self-justify or kind of cycle back into these interpretations. It could be that I'm wrong. It could be that I have good intent and there's something good in what I'm doing, but there needs some transition or breakthrough. I'm not against that idea. But in some ways, I do think there's some substance to what life has been drawing me into, and something. So one of the things about Christianity, so I'm not against the idea of Christianity. I like the character of Jesus and the way of Jesus and the testament that he speaks of. I've just gone through a lot of work to try to align in my life what it means as an Indigenous person with the historical experiences, looking at these interpretations and why it doesn't always sit well in my spirit. Parts of it does. There's good things to preserve there. There's a lot of good people. There's a lot of progress. There's plenty of things to preserve. But there's also areas where we get caught up in attaching it to other mechanisms and methodologies that just seem to disrupt, distort, or inhibit what the actual free message of it is. And then it causes people to interpret it in these limited ways, which then limit the way we see God and experience God. And it has all of these other profound effects. I'd even found that atheists that, go into debates against religion, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, etc., all other belief systems, they also critique Christianity based on these frameworks as well. And so what I'm pondering is that something we've known that's even within the teachings of Christianity, because I've been exposed to Christianity myself, like I've shared. I'm familiar with the language of it. I was, to some degree, in this modern world, we all understand some level of intersection of a type of cultural Catholicism or evangelicalism and, things like this. And also just there was a season in my parents' life and our network of friends where we're involved in certain types of Christianity, but also within our native communities. And there's just still numerous similar stories where just kind of caught in between those worlds, and it doesn't quite yet have a breakthrough of reconciling what's spiritually occurring there, right? So that's kind of where I find myself over the years. Then through my early 20s and whatnot, then I've become more familiar with the language of it, interacting with a variety of different people. Anyway, all these years later, I feel like I'm finally able to at least start articulating some of my questions and what doesn't, in the realm of belief and whatnot. I think it's kind of peculiar because at some level, whether you're talking philosophically or in religious circles, it becomes difficult for people to have a standard of judgment by which they gauge who's right or wrong. Because if someone wants to come in and simply just say, everything you say is deceptive, you're just deceiving me, you're demonic, what standard do you use to bring correction to that, right? Because if they say, if you do something good, you're deceiving us. If you use scripture, you're misusing it. So there's all these ways you can kind of malign or undermine what someone is saying and say that they're demonic. That happens all the time with a lot of things, even in like philosophical circles when they're not even talking about God or religion, if they're just talking about ethics or morality, and people will say, well, everything's relative. There isn't really a certain universal basis or standard. That's kind of where some of the atheists would get into debating what is a code of ethics or morality. That's where Sam Harris got into that territory of this arguing point of the moral landscape, where he tries to bring in a certain type of moral distinction based on, conscious creatures engaging well-being and what's better or worse, pertaining to the well-being of conscious creatures and stuff like that. As though there is a certain gauge of increasing wellness and decreasing suffering and stuff like that. I do draw upon a little bit of that, but I, in practice, shift things still a little bit more. Anyway, though, so kind of introducing some of these things. The first topic, so I don't get on to another rambling point or preliminary stuff. Hopefully just kind of get to the notes. So first off, one of the things that people often think is there's Christianity, and then there's like, say, indigenous culture or paganism, right? Things that are, in some ways kind of characterized by like pagan worship of other gods, right? Worshipping other gods instead of worshipping like the God, right? And so there becomes this difficulty where people that enter into, say, like Christianity or these belief systems that battle for the supreme God, not saying it should always be a battle, but it's become to some degree defined by that. It continuously turns into this idea of how people interpret the idea of conversion, basically absorbing everyone into this certain idea of God and then being against everything else. So it turns into these like our God versus your God, right? I think there's something incorrect about that approach and the way that conversion is looked at along those lines. Even that could be a long conversation that would be interesting for people to have. Like, my question here, so trying to keep this simple though without going into like too deep theology, I just kind of want to like introduce the topics. The first question is what actually, or the topic, or going into some of these ideas, what was Jesus actually doing? What was being enacted there? What was the spirit of liberation? And then from there, why was it expected to be expansive liberation to reach across the earth unto all mankind? And how is that different than how some people have interpreted the ideas of conversion in this like reemergence of looking at the conquest narratives? When I say conquest narratives, it's because in the midst of things, and say like whether you say the Old Testament or the Hebrew text, which then leads into like there, and then there's the New Testament, which is about the stage of introducing Jesus, the Christian ministry, or what becomes labeled as like Christianity, is totally different. There isn't a conquest narrative in Christianity. Eventually, when people get introduced to Christianity, they take upon themselves coupling it, associating it with, in the Old Testament, the conquest narratives. And so it reemerges as forming Christ and the message of Jesus into the conquest narratives as an extension of that same effort of our God against your God type thing. I don't believe that's what Jesus was doing. I don't believe that was what was like so profoundly spiritually revelatory there. There's a lot that can go into that conversation. I don't even think it was intended to be a conquest narrative. I think a lot of the testament of those things in the Hebrew text portray what humans do. It's kind of a mapping out of the conflict of world dominions. So a huge emphasis on a lot of my work and what it develops into. You know, as I talk about this, I was thinking I just kind of needed to get the ideas flowing. And so I did some like 2 previous intro preliminary chats leading up to my story, a little bit of what got me into this. They're really long. I didn't expect them to be long. I just got into talking. I probably just needed to share. I was thinking I'm not going to share that. I'm just going to skip forward now after I got that out of my system. And I'm just going to talk about these points now, like getting to the point. But maybe I will post those like preliminary 1, preliminary 2, and then kind of getting to the meat of these topics, right? I think in some sense it would be nice to connect with other people that discuss religion and just start talking about these things. You know, maybe as an Indigenous person and saying, all right, here's some questions that I have about Christianity. How do you feel about it in your spirit? Could we talk about some of these things at this point now that I, maybe feel more prepared to do it? It's been a long journey that I've been on, and it's on a spiritual journey. It hasn't been about rebellion. It hasn't been about like denying spiritual receptivity. I've committed so much of my life to developing these questions. And so anyway, maybe we'll get to that point. Let me stay on track here though. So this idea with this first topic or theme is, it's encompassed in what was different about what Jesus was doing that actually wasn't or isn't attached to the conquest narratives. We could talk about how I don't think that the conquest narratives are a testament to what God is actually like. I don't think that was part of what God was actually trying to do. A lot of the work that I developed into ended up being what I call systems theory, reading and understanding and interpreting a lot of the scripture through a system, through different systems that are functioned in, that people are born into. I start to feel or see that seems to be a accurate theme by which we gauge a lot of occurrences going on in scripture, and the means by which we would understand a different way of viewing Jesus as opposed to just personal sin or personal error. There is a sense where we work through personal freedom and our personal refinement and our personal access and standard unto God. So there is a language for something personal. But I think the freedom narratives, the liberation and whatnot is the system, the world dominion. And so what you find eventually is a lot of the language shifts in gauging what freedom from world dominion looks like. People might say, well, okay, so I was going to expand on that idea, but I think I'm going to resist going into the topics too much individually. Otherwise, this will be too long. So that's an introduction for that topic. I tend to think a lot of it reads more through the shift of world dominion and then allowing us to have our personal to, developing a collective freedom, spiritual freedom, attributes unto God, aligned unto God, situated in access to God. And somebody might say, how is that in practice then different than what we're kind of, saying? I think at some level, so this is another thing I'll have to just simplify. There's a lot that can be said there to expand on and to look at through scripture. But I think one aspect of it is to realize a lot of these functions and the way people interpret God, the way they interpret divisions when they just look at different individuals as like kind of these individualized demonizing of various groups. They don't always look at it as the systemic forces or gauging the level by which people are or are not free in systems, or they don't look at the system by which they function through as being a spirit or representation or methodology of seeking mutual freedom or spiritual connection. And I think that's what's also been a hindrance to the way that people have interpreted Christianity is they've attached it over time. Not every individual, not every small group, but just in general, on a systemic world level, they've attached Christianity to the world dominion system and methodology and practice. And so it clouds the way they view their testimony and the way that it's experienced by other groups. And that profoundly gets in the way of what's actually going on there. So there's ways to examine and question, refining what that means and what that looks like and how it changes the way people perceive other groups and how they're interpreting, expanding the message for spiritual liberation across the earth in ways, and doing it in such a way where it's not really giving that spiritual liberation in the way Jesus intended. So we could examine and look at what that is. So along with that point then goes into that question, what is this standard then? What does it look like? What is that corrective measure? How do you gauge when something is a spiritual breakthrough or receptivity and when it's a deception? And so then that's the topic. This is where we get into people think they're being deceived when you talk about reconciling things with, like, saying, for instance, it was incorrect to assume Native people did not have the Spirit of God. It was incorrect to think that Native people were not receptive to the spiritual trade and mutuality of God, because there's various testimonies that they were. It's that the conflict started to develop more so when the system didn't allow spiritual freedoms, didn't speak a standard of those truths. You can argue back and forth and say, well, that wasn't always just the churches. That was the system by which the churches were also entrapped in, but would also limit the way churches interpreted themselves because they were functioning in among world systems themselves and having a strange connection or trade of network governing kind of apparatuses, all of these other things we can kind of suppose, in retrospect, what influenced that. But there's all these corrective measures that can be made of, like, a lot of the claims against Native people, or some interpretations. There's actually numerous denominations, so these are generalizations. What we're not trying to say everyone or all churches or all denominations are guilty of all of these things. There's individuals that serve and they practice what they preach. They give service and spiritual receptivity and develop relationships. We're making reference in general because what we see in the world system and the influence of the world system is in those main world system dominions, the testimony comes from those platforms as to a very powerful, pervasive testament as to what God is like and the methodology of what God is. So that's what we're calling into question is this true? Because it has world geopolitical ramifications in those interpretations at some of the heights of power. But obviously that's not everybody within, right? So we're just calling to question whether that's true or not, and if that's an accurate testimony of what God is like or about or what Jesus was doing. So there's all these things that we find within like Native history and whatnot that just is not accurate in relation to, had people had more freedom to really practice in the methodology in the way of what Jesus gave testimony to, would we have had these conflicts? Would it have happened this way? And I don't think that it would have. A lot of people were limited in their survival mode of how they would view religion, and so they would impose upon other groups what was imposed upon them. So there really have been historical testimony to like needing to refine an increase of freedom, an increase of understanding religion, and a lot of like corrective measures. So then is no, it's not true that Native people were void of the Spirit of God. It's not true that they didn't have something to give to the spiritual inheritance and contribution. It's not true that they rejected the mutuality initially of this sharing of spiritual connection. And it's not true that they worshipped other gods. And it's not true that some of their expressions couldn't be incorporated in a relational spiritual connection to among the way of Jesus and, you know, things along these lines. I actually start to find is that the conflict came in among the spirit, the world dominion system, which then became a question of interpreting land and interpreting expansion and land and conquest and demonization, which that's what I say comes from those that started to influence interpreting expansion as conquest narratives, which I think is incorrect, which has continuously skewed the way that people are propping up ideas of God and still do to this day, which we see in the way that certain influences on the world stage are partnering and connecting to Israel, and Israel is still enacting the conquest narratives because it's not in the stage of the liberation that Jesus is talking about. So we're seeing this reemergence of the conquest narratives coinciding with world dominion systems. So along this line, I'm still on the point one. There's like, let's see, 1, 2, 3. That one might go together. 4, 5, 6. About 6 or 7. There could be more as I talk about it. I'm still on one. So hopefully, let me like kind of speed through this. So among those things, as I'm talking about, the stage of Jesus. So a lot of these things then, as people then in that framework resist the system and resist its claims, it cycles back this response of from that framework of conquest narrative, because incorporated in the conquest narrative is the stage where, and you have to see that this framework was more of like a very ancient approach to paganism and things like that. There's a lot of discussion that can go into the stage of conquest narrative. It reads as though the other groups are seen as demonic and child sacrifice and all of these other things, right? And, you know, maybe that could be the case. There are places around the world where it is to question, there is question as to being drawn into being deceived by what people think God needs or wants or desire. So in the context of the initial conquest narratives, way prior to the stage of Jesus, that was called into question. They wanted to destroy these places that were involved in these horrific things that had these horrific outcomes and were very destructive and corrosive to an otherwise ability to develop societies. That doesn't transfer over to every situation, and especially doesn't transfer over to the message in the way of Jesus. When people try to take on that framework, they can reinvent and recreate the scenarios by which they're trying to justify their beliefs. And so I think that's a lot of what's going on there, is that because certain stages of Christianity have attached themselves to those types of versions, because even in Judaism, they didn't even continue to practice the conquest narratives themselves. Their beliefs had evolved out from the conquest narratives. They had eventually started to see themselves in the similar imagery of those systems where you demonize the other group. And so even Judaism evolved out from the conquest narrative. That's why I also think that it was more of a portrayal of what humanity had been caught up in these cycles of good and evil, which is comparative to, in the story, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that they're cautioned to not get involved in, because it portrays this, what I think is systems where you divide groups and there's this divide between demonizing the other unto yourself. And so you find that eventually when they split among themselves, they do the similar thing. They demonize the other and then set themselves up as the alternative, this cycle of humanity. So even in Judaism, they evolve out from the conquest narrative. And eventually they are negotiating within systems at a different, with the opportunity for a different methodology. But those that keep getting caught up in the kind of tendency of those frameworks of the conquest narrative regenerate it. They regenerate the evils. They do evil things. And there's the historical accounts of evil begets evil begets evil. And it's always a cycle of justification for you against them. That is part of a major thing that Jesus came to shift as he interpreted the stories and whatnot. But anyways, to not get too far into all of those things and the details of it, like I said, each section of these can be a long form discussion or what have you. But in light of that, because of that, a lot of when Native people resist the system and resist its testament of their who they are in relation to God and these certain types of conversion stories, it's not as though there isn't any substance to the idea of conversion. There is something to just the universal practice of continual metamorphosis, transformation, going from season in season, because built into the way we are as human beings is each season of our life, we flow into another stage of growth and another stage of growth. And the way by which we synchronize transformation always has to solve and absorb for the increase of contribution. And so as we're exposed to other people and other groups, we have to keep solving for alignment as we go forward, as we align, as we transform. And so there's always an aspect of metamorphosis. So there is a sense where when you're introduced to this idea of synchronizing with this message or testimony of spiritual growth, there is a type of conversion. But I think what gets confused about it is that, numerous things do. But as I was saying, to kind of keep it simple, what gets confused about it is the way people interpret what, they reframe what conversion means as another version of us versus them, as good versus evil. Jesus is a huge shift out from that good versus evil portrayal of world dominion and self-justification. And he's the portion of corrective measure, like it says, the second Adam, revisiting those dynamics and resetting it and breaking out of that cycle of good and evil in the world dominions, as people battle each other with self-justification of their own unto others and demonize other groups. And he shifts it to this unit of life where there's a spirit of receptivity. There's this freedom to negotiate and whatnot, to recognize God at work in other places and to solve for the increase of those things, right? And it should be in the testimony of Jesus. There's something profoundly different in the approach, and we just are not on a large scale seeing that. And so people, even in good measure and good intent, they're trying their best to preserve and hold on to this idea of Jesus, because there's something you fall in love with in the testimony of the actual message of Jesus, and they want to preserve that. But they keep trying to solve for it in those frameworks of these world dominions and systems and these antagonized divisions. So then it gets into these battles where for them to defend this idea of these conversions of Christianity and interpretations of Jesus, they feel like they have to be at odds with people that seem to speak against it because they don't agree with the system. They don't agree with the methodology. And so it turns into like demonizing, or, you're resisting God, you're demonic, or this, that, and the other. So this introduces me to this question. So when Jesus, so interestingly enough, Jesus was accused of being demon possessed, or being a demon, or being demon possessed, or utilizing power of demons. And so then that's interesting to consider, right? A lot of people are accused of being demon possessed, being a demon, using demonic power. Some people are caught up in the misuse of drawing to themselves certain animations, or trying to develop for themselves world dominion power, or battling through hierarchies of power. Some people actually are doing that, but then some aren't, right? And so what we find in this example with Jesus is that even somebody that portrays this character in the story that is very attuned to God, that is very much a testament to the connection and the stage of growth unto God, is also just not, universally accepted or understood, to the point where the establishment in the system think that he is demon possessed. They, in their cycle of good versus evil, say he's evil. They say he's evil, that he's against them. They attach to him all of these claims, and then it comes out that that's not true, right? They are in error, and they don't see or recognize something that could actually be a change agent in everything that they were supposed to be about, right? That's just such a very profound, interesting part to the whole Jesus story, is that a lot of times we wonder, in all the ways that we ponder and examine existence, we wonder, why doesn't God just intervene? Why doesn't God send somebody to intervene? But the question we find there is, what about the way things have accumulated around existence makes it difficult for people to respond, even if opportunities were right in front of us? Even if, opportunities or connections were right there, already present in some portions in the way that we're created. We have what it is that we need to make change, but we don't understand it. That's such a interesting stage of the testimony of Jesus, or what he kind of reveals in his story. He's very much more of like a mystic guru type teacher. I mean, people even now shy away from that. They're nervous about the idea of saying guru or mystic and stuff like that. And that just kind of portrays that we have a hard time understanding how to map out our existence, how to map out the freedom by which we should have in God. And people are afraid. They don't know where to define these terms, right? Because Jesus starts saying stuff like that. He says stuff like, the kingdom is already here. Because they keep waiting, and they're like, no, we're waiting for this or waiting for that. And he's like, basically, it's already present. And then he says stuff like, he does these teachings on hell and other things. And it's this imagery where there's this chasm present between people where they see each other. And it's just a strange way of seeing it. It's like he's reframing and calling into question all of these ways that they think they interpret it. Like, no, wait, no, it's just this way where, no, we're not to the kingdom yet. And it's this split between this plane of existence where there's good and evil. We're not to the kingdom yet. And then it splits between good and bad. So you kind of see that the psyche at that point just can't really conceive of it. Almost like they're caught in this, I don't know, 2-dimension where everything just gets absorbed in like good and evil, linear, here now, kingdom later, good and bad, heaven and hell, right? And they can't stop thinking that way. Everything they look at is heaven or hell, heaven or hell. And so he's introducing these ideas of saying there's this shift happening where it's shifting people into perceiving even like expanding out from those confines to where the kingdom is already here. You just don't see it. You're having a hard time perceiving it. And hell is this chasm between, the mystery of that chasm between that you've created between you and these others. And that's just, they don't seem to really understand that at the time. So anyway, this first point, maybe I'll actually just break these into separate points because I'm taking too long to talk about the different points. So that's the first point, is just, I don't know that I summarized the point. I keep saying it's all, this whole thing is the first theme, talking about the world dominion. What was Jesus actually doing? What was different than these conquest narratives? And why did they not recognize him? Why is it so difficult to recognize him while being in the confines of the world dominion and that system of good and evil that splits everything? And what is the alternative way that Jesus was working among people? What other alternative methodology was there? And how does it call into question that divide between good and evil? And looking at the kingdom as so far off and not already here, being woven into and drawn into our present existence. What do we do with that? And why is the chasm between these divides made manifest or understood through the chasms that we've divided among each other? In that framework, that's what creates the perception of those things. And if that's changing, how does that change the way we look at that? And so anyway, that's the first question, right? And so then the next one is going into the question of the divide between good and evil and looking at that differently.